All right, we're ready for Isaiah chapter 17. We'll go through chapter 20 in our study tonight. Isaiah 17 to 20. This is our outline that we're following of the book of Isaiah. It's been a couple of weeks because we were out last week due to our gospel meeting. So let's remind ourselves where we've been and where we're going. The outline reflects the fact that there are two major sections to the book. Chapters 1 to 29 has to do with judgment from God during this Assyrian period, and we'll say more about the Assyrian period in a moment. And then there's comfort from God, and that is hope for troublesome times. So that's the future. And so we've looked at the prophecy against Judah and Jerusalem, chapters 1 to 12. Last time we started this section of the prophecy against the nations. Nearly every prophet has a nations section. Not all of those are toward the beginning. Jeremiah doesn't come to that till chapter 46. And so they will have sometimes shorter nation section or larger nation section, depending on the prophet. But most of the prophets, or several of the prophets at least, have what we call a nations section. This is an important section. So let's look at the nations we've listed thus far and which ones we're covering tonight. And we're going to keep this list running as we go through this nation section, which will carry us all the way through chapter 23. So we have Babylon. Now, we're not through with Babylon because we're going to come back to Babylon in chapter 21 next week. But be that as it may, last week we noticed Babylon and Moab. Chapters 13 and 14 dealt with Babylon, the fall of Babylon. And yet Babylon hasn't even risen in power yet because this is during the Assyrian period. And yet here's a nation that hasn't even come to a great power. There is a Babylon, but not a worldwide power yet at the time of this that Isaiah is prophesying. And yet it's going to fall, is the prophecy. Moab is going to fall. And in tonight's study, we're going to look at three nations. We're going to look at Syria, listed as Damascus, the capital, and then Ethiopia and Egypt. Now, there's more mention than just that, but those are the three major nations that are dealt with. So when we get through tonight, we will have covered these nations. There's a prophecy against Babylon, against Moab, against Syria, against Ethiopia, and against Egypt. Now, Assyria, not Syria, but Assyria, is also dealt with here, but it's not listed as one of the major nations. It is a major nation, but sprinkled through these nations this nation section is a prophecy that Assyria is going to fall. And we'll see more about that as the lesson unfolds tonight. Now, we looked at this in detail last time, and I'll remind you this again next time, that this is what is accomplished or learned in the nation section. If you weren't here last week, I encourage you to go back and watch the video or listen to the podcast of the study. And the point to be made here is quite often when we get to the nations section, we sometimes think this is boring. This isn't dealing with God's people. This isn't dealing with Judah or Israel. This doesn't directly relate to us. And so what benefit do I get out of seeing Babylon and Moab and Egypt and Syria is going to fall? And so here's what we've learned or will learn from this section. God is in control of the nations. That's an important lesson to learn. That God is the God of all the nations. He's not just the God of Judah and Israel, but He's the God of Egypt. Now, they may not recognize Him as their God, but He's still their God. He is the God over all nations. And we see that God uses nations as tools, and we see that again in our study tonight. We'll see that God is fair in dealing with the nations. We made the point last time that it wouldn't be fair if God punished Egypt, but He doesn't punish His own people for the same thing, and vice versa. And furthermore, we notice that God's working out His purpose in His time. We're going to see that in chapter 18 tonight, that God's doing His own thing in His own time, and He doesn't need any help from man. And we see the nations are held accountable, just like individuals. God holds a nation accountable, and He'll raise up a nation, and He'll make a nation fall. And God will strike a nation, and at the same time, He'll heal a nation. That's going to be important when we get to Egypt a little bit later, in Ethiopia as well. And then we're going to talk also, and we'll see that the reason nations are destroyed is their sin and their rebellion. Particularly, we saw this in the conquest of Canaan, as the people of Israel conquested Canaan, that God didn't drive them out simply because He wanted to make room for the people of Israel. He drove them out because of their sin. And we're going to see that all through this nation's section here. So here's what happens now in chapters 17 to 20. This is prophecy against the nations, and specifically Syria and Ethiopia and Egypt. Now, this is the outline that's in the workbook if you're following the workbook. that we put out. It's on our website. If you don't have that, we can give you access to that. But three things happen. Syria and Israel will suffer the common fate. Now, this is a prophet to Judah, the southern kingdom, but he's going to talk about Israel. And that's going to serve as a warning to Judah. But he talks about Israel, the northern kingdom, in chapter 17. Then chapter 18, he talks about Ethiopia seeks an alliance with Judah, and they're told to wait on the Lord. I'm working out my plan in my time, and we're not going to work at it on your timetable. And then we're going to see in 19 and 20, they go together. Egypt will face judgment and will fear. And so there's some unique things, for example, when we get to chapter 20, that we don't find anywhere else in the Old Testament for that matter. So let's continue now the prophecies against the nation by talking about chapter 17. Chapter 17 is simply Syria and Israel will suffer a common fate. Now let's get an idea where Damascus is. Notice he said at verse 1, a burden against Damascus. The burden is a prophecy, but a burden seems to be a prophecy almost always of doom. Not all prophecies are doom, but this simply means a prophecy, but usually that term burden is used with reference to a prophecy of doom. But to give you an idea of what we're talking about or where we're talking about, Damascus, you have Jerusalem right here inside the circle, and then Syria is the nation just to the north of that. And Damascus was its capital, thought I had another closer look at Syria. But Damascus is the capital of Syria, so that's the nation about which he prophesies in chapter 17. So now let's go back to chapter 17 in verses 1 to 4. The first thing we notice is that Damascus will fall. Damascus is going to fall. Now watch for the switch. By talking about Damascus, and that is meaning Syria is going to fall. This is again a prophecy against the nation. And then suddenly he turns and starts talking about Israel. And we'll see that shift in a moment. Behold, Damascus will cease from being a city and will become a ruinous heap. The cities of Aroer are forsaken. That is, other cities throughout Syria are going to be desolate. And what's going to happen to those cities? Well, look at verse 2, that they will be for flocks. In other words, it'll become so desolate, these cities that were once occupied and populated will become so desolate, it'll be a place indeed for flocks to dwell. Now notice at verse 3 now, the fortress also will cease from Ephraim. Now Ephraim has a reference to Israel, the northern kingdom. And so perhaps he's talking about the fortress being Samaria, the capital of Ephraim or Israel. The kingdom from Damascus and the remnant of Syria will be as the glory of the children of Israel. Now notice what he just said. What he said is he just shifted gears from talking about Syria. Damascus is going to fall. And then in verse 3 he turns and talks about the fortress of Ephraim will fall. So here seems to be what God is saying. There seemed to be this idea, as we pointed out in the workbook, that Syria, that nation to the north, had wanted to form an alliance. Syria and Israel had tried to form an alliance to fight their common enemy, that is Assyria. So Syria and Israel seem to be wanting to form an alliance. Let's fight together. Israel now is putting confidence in Syria rather than in God. And let's form an alliance and let's fight against Assyria. And so God is saying to them in chapter 17, he's saying, if you want to be tied to Syria, then be tied to Syria. You're going to suffer the same fate as Syria. That's a powerful lesson to learn. We'll say more about that perhaps in the invitation a little bit later. But if you want to be tied to Syria, be tied to Syria. I'll tie you both together and I'm going to punish you together. You're going to get the same punishment they got. So that's what he's saying in verses 1 to 4. Now look at verse 4. He said, in that day it shall come to pass that the glory of Jacob will wane, and that's Jacob, that is Israel. The glory of Jacob will wane, it'll diminish, and the fatness of his flesh will grow lean. That is, the glory fades and the fatness becomes lean, means that Israel is going to diminish. So Israel is going to suffer the same fate because they wanted to tie their wagon to to Syria's horses, basically, so to speak. And so God said, I'll let you do it. I'll let you tie your horses up to them. Y'all can join together, and I'm going to give you the same thing. So thus the point being made, they suffer the common fate. Damascus is going to fall. Israel's going to fall. Now the destruction is going to be thorough for both. So notice he said at verse 5, it will be as a harvester gathers grain, and they reap the heads with the arm. And he said that the one who gathers the heads of grain in Rephaim, and the gleaning of the grapes and the olive trees, they leave just a little. The point is that when they gather the grapes, they leave just a little behind. That's all. It's a pretty thorough gathering of the grapes. The same thing of the olives. Off of the olive trees, there'll be a little in the top that'll be left, but it's a thorough gathering of the grapes and of the olives. So when God deals with Damascus, that is Syria, and God deals with Israel, it's going to be thorough. It's going to be thorough destruction. That's the point being made. So says the Lord God of Israel. Now let's start at verse 7 now. Here's the reason, here's the problem. Israel forsook God when they put their trust in Syria. Now this is the whole point of Isaiah. When I say the whole point, we're going to get to some messianic things time and again. But the point of the book of Isaiah is, here is a nation, whether you're talking about Israel or Judah, they put their confidence in other nations rather than in God. And we're going to end on that note in chapter 20. And so here's his point. You tried to form an alliance, and when you did, you were putting your confidence in a nation and not in God. So now let's notice at verse 7. In that day, that's an interesting phrase used throughout our study tonight. You might underline it every time you see it. In that day, a man will look to his Maker, and his eyes will have respect for the Holy One of Israel. What's the point? Well, the point is that Israel is going to finally reach the point that they're going to turn to their God, and they're going to recognize that He was the one in power and not these idols. But it's going to be too late. Now we'll go back over that again. But he said, look at verse 8. He will not look to the altars or to the work of his hands. He will not respect what his fingers have made, nor the wooden images, nor the incense. In other words, he's going to come to recognize we can't put our trust and our confidence in the idols that we turned to in Syria. We went to Syria for help. We trusted in their idols, and it didn't work. But when they learn that lesson, it's too late. It's too late. Because Syria fell in 732 BC. 10 years later, Israel fell, 722 BC. And so you have in your handout to looking for some dates, and that's two of the dates. Syria fell, 732 BC, and Israel fell 10 years later, 722 BC. And so they didn't learn. When they finally got their eyes open, you know what? This forming an alliance with Syria didn't help us. It was too late. And that's the point he's making here. They learned the lesson, but it was too late. Now, notice at verse 9, in that day his strong cities are now going to be desolate, that there be forsaken the uppermost branch which they left because of the children of Israel, there will be desolation. So it's going to be a thorough desolation for Damascus and also for Israel, the northern kingdom. Now verse 10 it tells me the reason for this. This gets to the point here, point C. They forsook God. You might underline this at verse 10. Because you have forgotten the God of your salvation. They forgot the God of their salvation. And they were not mindful. In other words, they did not respect the rock of their stronghold. God was their rock and God was their strength. They forgot all about that. Therefore, this is an interesting phrase. You will plant pleasant plants, and you will set out seedlings, foreign seedlings. What's the point? When they turned to Syria and they turned to idolatry, this is talking about Israel now. When they turned to idolatry, what they were doing was planting foreign plants and foreign seedlings. In other words, they were planting things, and they're going to reap things that they don't really want to reap. It's like going and gathering some foreign seeds that you don't even know what it is, but you're going to plant them in your garden, and when it grows up, this is not what you were wanting. You were wanting beans and corn and tomatoes, and you thrown these foreign seeds in, and this is not what I wanted. And that's exactly what they've done. We were wanting deliverance from Assyria by turning to idolatry, but it didn't work. So you planted some foreign seeds. You planted foreign plants. Here's what you're going to reap. Look at verse 11. And in the morning you will make your seeds to flourish, but the harvest will be a heap of ruins. It's not what they wanted. And in the day of grief, desperate sorrow. So you're going to reap something that you didn't intend on. You want to be tied to Syria? Be tied to Syria. It's not going to turn out like you want it. I guarantee you, it's not going to turn out like you want it. Now, beginning at verse 12, the nation used to punish God's people will be defeated too. He's talking about Assyria. Not Syria with an S, Syria is what he's talking about here, most likely. And I say most likely because Assyria is not identified per se, but it seems to be hinted at verse 11. Woe to the multitude of many people. Most think that that is a reference to Assyria, which makes this point, and I'm on a footnote, that that's saying God's in control. He's in control of Assyria, which is the big threat at the moment. God's in control of Assyria. God's going to take care of Assyria, and God's going to scatter. Now, what about Assyria? Well, everybody's afraid of Assyria. Syria is, Israel is, Judah is, Egypt is, and Ethiopia is. They're all afraid of Assyria. And they're frightened of Assyria. You know who's not afraid of Assyria? We're going to see a picture of God in the next chapter, patiently waiting and unafraid. He's calm, he's resting. And God's going to deal with Assyria. So here's the picture. Assyria roars like the seas. In other words, they make a lot of noise. And they seem to be mighty, and they're rushing like the rushing of the mighty waters, and the nations will rush like the rushing of many waters, but God will rebuke them. God's going to deal with Assyria. And what's going to be? Well, he said, and they'll flee away, and they'll be chased like chaff. You see, this nation that seems so mighty, that's roaring in like the roaring of the seas, and is scaring you to death, and you're trying to form an alliance, God's going to blow them away like chaff. That's what God's going to do. And it's like grass, dry grass on the pavement, and you just blow and it's gone. God's going to do that. He's going to take care of Assyria. And then, look at verse 14 to finish the chapter. At eventide trouble, and before the morning he is no more. In other words, I don't think that literally means it's going to be one night and the next morning Assyria is going to be gone, but it's like overnight God takes care of Assyria. When God's through with Assyria, God takes care of Assyria, and God's done with Assyria. God's using Assyria as a tool. So what has happened in chapter 17? Assyria is the threat. Syria with the S and Israel form an alliance, or try to form an alliance. We're going to fight against Assyria. And God said, Damascus is going to fall, and you want to be tied to Syria, you be tied to it, you're going to fall too. That's what's going to happen. The destruction is going to be thorough, and your problem is you forsook God and you turned to Syria instead. And then I'm going to punish that nation that I'm using. All right, let's move to chapter 18 now. In chapter 18, we have Ethiopia being dealt with. So let's find Ethiopia on our map, and then we'll come back to what the text has to say about Ethiopia. This is a modern map of, here is Egypt, and then Ethiopia is in this region. Also identified as Cush. So in this region, this would be Egypt, and down in this region, this is the land of Canaan. This is where Ethiopia would be. So what do we know about Ethiopia? Well, let's go to chapter 18. Now this is a short chapter, but there's a lot to be learned from this short chapter about Ethiopia. They send messengers. They send messengers to Jerusalem, to Judah, to Jerusalem. And we see that in verses 1 and 2, and then Isaiah gives an answer, and then Ethiopia is going to bring gifts to the Lord. Now that seems a little confusing. And if it is a little confusing to you, well then you're in tune with us, because that is a little confusing when we get there, until we begin to get an explanation of what that last section will be. And we'll get to that here in a second. So, woe to the land. It's interesting to me, and I don't have a real explanation for it, that he doesn't use the word burden here at chapter 18, but woe to the land shadowed with buzzing wings, perhaps a land infested with insects. And it may be a play, as some have suggested, that you are infested with buzzing wings. That's not what you need to worry about. You need to worry about something else. Maybe so, I'm not sure. But what I learn in verses 1 and 2 is that Ethiopia sends messengers to Jerusalem. It's a little hard to understand where the shift takes place from the messengers coming to Jerusalem and the message going back to Ethiopia. But there has to be a shift, because by the time you get to verse 3, a shift has taken place. So where did it take place? Well, we'll see if we can figure that out here. But woe to the land shouted with buzzing wings, which is beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, or the footnote will say Cush, which we identified on the map, which send ambassadors by sea, even in vessels of reed on the water, and they're called at verse 2, swift messengers. So that may suggest, as some have suggested, that the fact that they are swift messengers may suggest there is some urgency of trying to form again an alliance. So here's the story over again, where Ethiopia is going now to Judah. Syria and Israel's tried to form an alliance. Now we have Judah and Ethiopia coming to Judah trying to form an alliance. And they're going to fight the common enemy again, and that is Assyria. They are the big threat. Now, Assyria was the threat from about 720 to 702 BC. But be that as it may, I think the shift takes place right after, he said, even in vessels, I'm reading at verse 2, of reed on the waters. Now, the word saying has been supplied. And then he said, go swift messengers. This seems to be the message of Isaiah. So I'm starting at 2b. This is Isaiah's message for the messengers to go back to Ethiopia with this message. And so what is the message? Well, let's get the gist of the message and then we'll work through and see how we got there. The gist of the message is wait. God's going to do this. But wait on what? Wait on the Lord. Why wait on the Lord? They seem to be swift messengers. We've got to get the help of Judah and fight with us, because we've got to fight against our enemy, Assyria. If we're going to survive, we've got to go and fight against Assyria. And God's just saying, hang on, wait. I'm going to deal with Assyria. And let Syria do what it wants to do, and I'm going to deal with Syria when I'm done with Assyria. And so y'all don't need to form any alliances. Judah don't need any help. I'm their help if they'll turn to me for help. And the same thing is with Ethiopia. I'm their help if they'll turn to me for help. You don't need to turn to another nation. So that's the point being made. Just wait, because God's going to do it. And he doesn't need your help. So let's see how we got to that point. So he says, go swift messengers to a nation tall and smooth of skin. That's Ethiopia. Now, let's jump down and get ahead of ourselves. And we see that phrase again down at verse 7, a people tall and smooth of skin. That's the people of Ethiopia. So in other words, what Isaiah is saying to the messengers is, go home. You come here to form an alliance, go home. Just go back home. To a people terrible from the beginning onward, a nation powerful and treading down, whose land the rivers divide. Go back to Ethiopia. And then he calls it, verse 3, for all the inhabitants of the earth. And what does he say in this? Well, he's calling for all nations to watch what God's going to do. And so what does he say? Well, at verse 3, all inhabitants and dwellers of the earth, when he lifts his banner, I think he's talking about Assyria. When Assyria lifts his banner on the mountains, you will see, and when he blows the trumpet, you will hear. When Assyria starts to move, let Assyria move. And one thing God will do, he will stop Assyria before it takes a nation God doesn't want it to take. Now, that's an important point. If God doesn't want him to take Ethiopia, it's not going to take Ethiopia. And it's not going to take Egypt, and it's not going to take Judah, and not going to take any other nation if God doesn't want it to. So, that's the point to be made. Now, this is the picture I mentioned a moment ago of God calmly. Here is Syria over here just shaking in their boots. We got to get some help from Israel. And Israel's shaking in their boots. Ethiopia is shaking in their boots, and so is Judah shaking in their boots about the threat of Assyria. Tell you who's not shaking is God. Look at verse 4. For the Lord said to me, this is Isaiah speaking, the Lord said to me, I will take my rest. Now get the picture. God just calmly sitting and waiting. I'm going to take my rest. I'm not bothered. I'm not excited. I'm not disturbed. Syria doesn't bother me. I can handle Assyria. I will take my rest. You might underline that. I will take my rest. I will look from my dwelling place like the clear heat in the sunshine and like the cloud of the dew in the heat of the harvest. In other words, God is waiting like giving sunshine and dew to the crop. I'm just waiting till it's ready. It's like a farmer saying, why don't you get out there and harvest the corn? Well, it's not ready yet. I'm waiting for the rain. And when the rain comes and the sun comes and let it grow a little more, then I'm going to harvest. So God, why don't you take Assyria down now? I'm not ready to. I'm letting the sun shine on it. I'm letting the dew fall on it. I'm letting the rain hit the crop. Destruction will wait till God's ready. God has his timetable. We learned that in our study last time. Now, for before the harvest, when the bud is perfect and the sour grape is ripening in the flower, he will cut off both sprigs and the pruning hooks and take away and cut down the branches. In other words, when God's ready, he's going to take care of Assyria. He's going to do it in his own time. And God's not afraid. So here's the point I'm learning from that. And that is, before Assyria reaches the point of taking Judah or Ethiopia, God will take it down, and it will be, according to verse 6, it will be left desolate. It'll be left together as the mountain of birds of prey and the beast of the earth will gather there. In other words, that's a common expression referring to how desolate a nation would become. Now this gets into, if that was not that difficult, if you got lost in that, well, you probably will get even more lost here at verse 7. And that is, Ethiopia brings gifts to the Lord. And that's a little obscure, seems like. What is he talking about? Well, some think that literally there were some nations that did bring gifts to the Lord, and Ethiopia did. I'm not sure 2 Chronicles 32, 22 and 23 fit exactly. I've got that as a footnote in the workbook. Some commentators ignore that, making me think they think it doesn't even fit at all. And some very reputable scholars that I hold in high esteem, like Humphreys and others, don't even mention 2 Chronicles 32 at this juncture. But be that as it may, let's get verse 7 and see if we can make some sense of that. That at verse 7, in that time a present will be brought to the Lord of hosts from the people, tall and smooth of skin, that is of Ethiopia. A nation powerful and treading down. He's already described them as that, where the rivers divide to the place of the name of the Lord of hosts, to Mount Zion. Now that phrase Mount Zion is kind of a key phrase which kind of throws off signals there to us, and alarms go off when we see that, which suggests to us this is messianic. So we're trying to mark messianic sections. I've encouraged you to write in pencil in your Bible because you may later time change your mind. And so write out in the margin of your Bible if you want to in pencil, because you may come back and say, I disagree. Humphreys thinks that this is a time when Ethiopia would be reached with the gospel. Acts 8 would be a case with the Ethiopian eunuch. And what we're going to mention later in the next chapter about the blending of some concepts, where the messianic message just blends in with the present day message of Isaiah, and you don't see a big distinction in time. But perhaps he is talking about a messianic time, that Ethiopia is seeking an alliance, and God says, go back and wait on the Lord, put your trust in me instead of in Judah, and Judah, you put your trust in me and not in Ethiopia. And there's going to come a time when Ethiopia is going to turn to the Lord, and they will praise God and bring gifts to the Lord. And furthermore, it will be at Mount Zion. I think messianic. I think Humphreys is right, that's probably messianic. So mark that one if you wish, and if you think it's not, then don't mark that. And then study that out for yourself. All right, now that's chapter 18. Now let's move to the last two, and this is a little more involved, 19 and 20. Egypt is going to face judgment, and they will fear. I'm not going to have to find Egypt on the map. You know where Egypt is. And so the nation of Egypt is listed here. And so here's, first of all, a prophecy against Egypt in chapter 19. So let's see if we can work through chapter 19. God's judgment is pictured in verse 1 as riding on the swift cloud. God's coming in riding on the swift cloud. He's pictured later at verse 16 of waving his hand. So God is bringing judgment upon Egypt. Now, Egypt was the nation that Judah later turns to and thinks this is our only hope. Our only hope for fighting off the enemy is to turn to Egypt for help. But Egypt's going to fall. Egypt is not that strong. So Egypt is going to fall, but notice the reasons that it falls. There are 5 reasons given in the context. Could this happen to us today? And the answer is yes. First of all, there's going to be internal strife. Notice at verses 1 and 2, I will set Egyptians against Egyptians, and neighbor against neighbor, and city against city, and a kingdom against kingdom. Jesus himself said, a kingdom divided, it cannot stand. And so here's internal strife, fighting from within. And this is not a political statement, though do with it what you want to. If you want to take it political, then have at it. But those who are stirring strife within our nation and want to see strife in our nation are contributing to the downfall of our nation. That internal strife of trying to a war against one another is designed to bring a nation down. God said so here. Now, the second thing that he mentions at verse 3 is their religion fails. The spirit of Egypt will fail in the midst, and I will destroy their counsel. So they turn to idols and to charmers and to mediums, and that all collapses and fails. So their religious efforts failed. Their idolatry failed. Well, here's another thing. Verse 4, another king will conquer them. And the Egyptians I will give into the hand of a cruel master. That would be the Assyrians. In 671 BC, Assyria took them. So Assyria is going to take them. So at verse 5 through 10, there's going to be natural and economic disaster. So could that be used? And by the way, every one of these are tools of God. That doesn't mean God causes them, but God can use them. So here's natural disaster. So whether it be, like at verse 5, it talks about the rivers, the waters fail from the sea. So in other words, there's going to be a drought, and the plants all wither. And the fishermen mourn at verse 8 because their business is gone. The fine flax of verse 9 and the fine fabric is not available anymore. And so the foundation will be broken. So basically the economic circumstance fails. So there's natural and economic disaster, and that brings a nation down. God can use that as a tool. Now this is interesting, 11 to 15. Their counsel fails. In other words, they turn to the wrong place for advice. Surely the princes of Zon are fools. Pharaoh's wise counselors have given foolish counsel. The New American Standard says they've become stupid. I told you Sunday night that was a biblical term. There it is, found in Proverbs as well. So they have become stupid in their counsel. They are fools in their counsel. They gave the wrong advice. And so God ridicules them, saying, where is the wise and where are they now? And let them know what, I'm reading at the end of verse 12, the Lord of hosts has purposed against Egypt. If your counselors, your wise men of Egypt, are so smart, let them tell us what God's going to do with Egypt. And let's see if they're right. Because they're not going to say that Assyria is going to take them. But Assyria is going to take them, which means they're stupid because they don't know what's going on. All right. Now at verse 13, notice he mentions Noph or Noph. That's Memphis, which is in Egypt. And then look at verse 14. God has mingled a perverse spirit in her midst. That's parallel to, I think, in principle, to 2 Thessalonians 2, 10 through 12, which something here is God allowing deception. God doesn't cause it, but God allows deception. So the point is their counsel failed. So here's the prophecy against Egypt. Egypt is going to collapse. See if you don't see some similarities to our own nation in that. Now let's talk about the result of the judgment upon Egypt in 16 to 25. What's the result? Well, the result is, in that day, that phrase is used numerous times here, in that day, Egypt will be like women who will be afraid and fear because of the waving of the hand of the Lord. So what's going to happen? When God brings down Egypt, that's going to cause fear and terror. That's one of the things. Now then, here's where we're going to shift gears. They're going to change and they're going to turn. And you're not put on notice that suddenly things have shifted. But now we're about to talk about the Messiah. So this next section of verses 18 through 25 is basically messianic. And how do I know? Well, let's work through that, and then I'll make some sense of that. That in that day there would be 5 cities that will speak the language of Canaan and swear by the Lord. And in that day there will be an altar of the Lord in the midst of the land of Egypt. So what am I learning from this? Well, here's the changes that takes place. There's going to be a small portion, a remnant, that turns to the Lord. Not a great deal of them, but it's going to be a small remnant. Now here's where we know it's dealing with the Messiah. Look at verse 20. They will call to the Lord because of their oppressor, and he will send a Savior, a mighty one, and he will deliver them. That's the Messiah. I'm convinced that's the Messiah. And notice, they're going to know the Lord, and they're going to know, be known by him. Verses 21 and 22. It's going to be a day of peace and harmony. This is evidence that it's talking about the day of the Messiah. In that day, there will be a highway from Egypt to Assyria, and the Assyrian will come into Egypt, and the Egyptian into Assyria, and the Egyptians will serve with the Assyrians. And in that day, Israel will be one of 3 with Egypt and Assyria. There's not a case in history where you'll find that was true literally. That cannot be documented historically. So it must have reference to the day of the Messiah, where the Assyrian, the Egyptian, and Israel are all one. The point is, they're all one in Christ. They're all one in the body. And so it's a day of peace and harmony prevails. Rather than the nations warring, all are one. It doesn't matter what nation you're from, what nationality you're from, we're all one in Christ. Now, let me stop just for a moment to make this point right here. I borrowed this concept from John Humphreys. He taught me this 35, nearly 40 years ago. And the prophet sometimes will prophesy about the present time. Forget the chart for a moment. Just listen to me, and then let's go to the chart. He'll prophesy about the present time, and then right in with that, he talks about the Messiah. Now, Peter tells us that the prophet didn't fully understand about the Messiah, but he's preaching by inspiration. And he makes no distinction in time. So here's what I want you to see right here. I want you to see that from the prophet is looking at 2 mountain ranges. Let's just picture a man looking at 2 mountain ranges. There's a mountain range and there's another mountain range. They just blend together. I can't tell much difference in one mountain range and the other. It looks like there's just one mountain continuing. But when we take a side view, as he looks at that all blends together. We take a side view, there's quite a distance between this mountain range and that mountain range, but from his point of view, it all blends together. So what the prophet does, he talks about things in the day of Isaiah, and he talks about how Egypt is going to fall, etc., and there's going to be fear. And then he talks about the day of the Messiah and blends it all together as if it's one point at the same time. We have an advantage because we live in the day of the Messiah. We can look back and say, okay, I see he's talking about the day of the Messiah. So what helps me is I put a little diagram like this that I borrowed from John Humphreys. Here's the prophet looking at 2 mountains, and they blend together. That just reminds me of that blending concept. Does that make sense? All right. I think that's what he did right here. Otherwise, I have some real problems with the text, and what I mean by that is the problem I have with the text is that I've got to find in history where these nations dwelled together in unity and harmony and didn't fight. And you can't find that. You can't document that in history. And so this must be talking about the day of the Messiah. So that's the result that comes. Now then, let's go to chapter 20. Now this gets interesting here. Let's see if we can finish up at chapter 20. Here's a sign to Judah not to put confidence in Egypt or Ethiopia. This is part of the message, if not one of the main thrust of the message of the book. We saw that in chapter 31. We jumped over there at the beginning in our introduction. To put your confidence in God and not in a nation. So here's 2 things he said. He said, consider Ashdod. That's in the land of Philistia. I don't think his prophecy here is a prophecy against a nation as such, but he's using them as an illustration. So what happened with Ashdod? If you're looking at the workbook, if you've got that, I'm just going to read a section that I wrote in that the city of Ashdod, a Philistine city, had been under Assyrian control. They rebelled against Assyria, and they sought the help from Egypt and Ethiopia. And yet, despite all of that help, Sargon, the king, sent Tartan, who was the chief of, commander-in-chief, basically his top military guy, to capture the city in 711 BC, and he did capture the city. In other words, his alliance with Egypt and Ethiopia didn't help. That's the point. What he's saying is, Egypt and Ethiopia will be no help to you, Judah. It didn't help Ashdod. And if it didn't help them, it's not going to help you. Second point, chapter 20. Isaiah is told to walk around naked and barefooted. Now, if this was your first reading of Isaiah, this is kind of surprising. I wasn't expecting that. And I was because I've read it before, but I wasn't expecting that the first time I read that. Because what God said to him, go and remove your sackcloth on your body and take your sandals off and walk around naked and barefoot. I don't think that meant he was nude. Perhaps only some have suggested maybe a captive's garb. Others have suggested a loincloth. Or some have suggested an inner garment only. But whatever it was said to be naked, and that term is used with reference to partial disrobing as well as completely disrobing, and go barefooted. And he was to do that for 3 years. And what that was to illustrate and demonstrate is, notice at verse 4, so shall the king of Assyria lead away the Egyptians as prisoners and the Ethiopians. In other words, this was testimony to Egypt and Ethiopia, just as Isaiah is walking around in captive garb. He's walking around in a garment that looks like he's taken captive. And it's embarrassing of what is being exposed. And that's going to happen to you, Egypt, and that's going to happen to you, Ethiopians. You're going into captivity. So, don't put your confidence in Egypt or in Ethiopia, because the same thing is going to happen to you. Now, I want to make 2 points before we're through. Let's go to verse 5. I think his point here is to Judah. Then shall they be afraid and ashamed of Ethiopia, and their expectation of Egypt their glory. You might write out to the margin, Judah's confidence was in the wrong place. Judah's confidence was in the wrong place. When you see Egypt fall and when you see Ethiopia fall, you're going to learn your confidence was in the wrong place. And that's the point. That's the point. Now I want to go back, and I said 2 points. I want to make another one. And let's go back to verse 2 and 3. I want you to know this is what Edward J. Young calls blind obedience. And that is, it seems that Isaiah obeyed and took his garments off and his shoes off and walked around barefoot and naked before he knew and understood the point. So how do you know? Look at verse 2. God said, go remove the sackcloth from your body and take your sandals off your feet. And he did so, walking around naked and barefoot. Then the Lord said, just as my servant has walked naked and barefoot 3 years. It seemed to me that Isaiah's walking around barefoot and naked before he ever understood why. So why does he do it? And we'll end on this note. Because God told him to do it. Period. We'll stop there.